Rohan, how are you doing?
Morning. I'm doing well, man. How are you?
Very well, very well. We wanted to spend today's episode talking about identity, but from a non-technical lens, given these are two extraordinarily non-technical people here. But before that, I was just thinking about how the week unfolded in front of us. It is no joke that tech is the story of our generation, and we were talking about it just yesterday. The fact that ours is a generation that has seen so much change. But everything in the news, including this morning, when I woke up to the fact that Elon Musk had not just gutted the leadership of Twitter after walking into that building
With the kitchen sink.
with a kitchen sink, but he also wrote a very heartfelt note to advertisers.
He did, and I was most unlike him.
Very unlike him.
I don't expect to see words like that
Not
come
at
off
all.
Elon Musk.
It makes me wonder if the entire thing is therefore a joke at a very meta level. But it's very evident that while tech is the story of our generation, the upheaval in the relationship between tech and advertising is also extremely important and relevant today. One of the things we did with our team is open up all the earnings reports from big technology companies that came out. This was earnings week. Everyone from Netflix, Snap, Meta, Google, or Alphabet, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon put out earnings reports, and the pundits are all over it. I was very curious to know what your first takeaways are when looking at all those earnings reports.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly been a bad week for big tech, right? I think the list of companies that you mentioned have come out of this week about $1 trillion down in valuation. And I know they made up a little bit of that over the last day or two. I think Apple's results were on par with expectations or maybe slightly better. But all in all, I think it's safe to say these stocks have been battered in a week, right? And that's down to any number of reasons, right? It's been a bad year for everyone, right? We've come out of, it sounds silly to say, but the highs of COVID, right? At least the highs of COVID growth in advertising and in services, right? We've got a war going on. There's signs of a recession. Companies are seeing strange foreign exchange headwinds, right? Apple's come out and said, their revenue effectively slowed down by 10% only thanks to foreign exchange effects, right? And pretty much all these companies have said something along similar lines, right? That plus we're seeing the effects of maybe a slowdown in advertising and certainly the effects of ATT on everyone who is not Apple, right? And that combination of things is kind of, it's led to one or two bad quarters for this set of companies now, and that's just reflected in their results.
Yeah. You've been a finance man in some part of your career, and I have never been anywhere close to a finance team. But I keep thinking about something that Warren Buffett once said, which is, he said the stock market is like this manic, depressive, cranky old man, and you cannot predict which way it will react, and so much so that it tends to overreact. And I look at all of these factors, macroeconomic factors, foreign exchange, ATT, a recession, war, as seismic activity that's affecting the advertising market. And the thing about seismic activity is you really can't predict which way or the depth of impact that you're going to hit. Enough to say that if a 20-year-old company or a 30-year-old company can still have double-digit fluctuation in stocks, it is something that's going to be very hard to predict.
Yeah, and I think I think one of the big reasons this has happened is these are companies that have had a multi-year, some case multi-decade track record of just steady growth. And all of a sudden, at the end of that, they've either flattened out, or in the case of Meta, Facebook, they've kind of had a quarter of degrowth, right? Maybe that was last quarter, not this one. Yeah, but something has slowed down, right? In Meta's case, especially, I think people are also questioning their business model and their vision for the future and all these things that I won't even pretend to understand.
Yeah. I want to get into ATT a little bit because, like you mentioned, it is one of the factors that could explain what's going on with these companies. And of course, it's had a huge impact on several of the organizations we're discussing and from an advertising standpoint. And I noticed through all of the earnings reports that there is a lot of CEOs shaking their fists at Apple for payments, for the payments ecosystem, for ATT, and effectively trying to not scare Wall Street into thinking that any of the damage is permanent. We've touched upon ATT a few times on this podcast, but I want to get into a little bit of detail around what exactly it is. Like, what the hell did Apple do through this that has caused so much of a stir that even the biggest big tech companies have been unable to build a response or work their way around it. So what is your layman explanation of what ATT is?
Yeah, so the simplest way I have to put it is that ATT is just a consent layer, right? It requires any app on the Apple ecosystem to seek user consent before they track and use their data externally, right? That's kind of the simplest way I can put it, right?
Right.
The flip side of this is that that definition of tracking doesn't seem to extend to Apple itself, right? So from what I can understand, Apple is free to use this data as its first-party data to whatever extent it pleases, and customers have to explicitly give consent for anyone else to use it, right? Now, as a result of this, you've got advertisers all over the world who are now suffering from a limitation of customer data, right? I don't know exactly what the opt-in rate is, right? I'm told it started off pretty high, but then over time it's kind of tapered down to a level that maybe more people would expect. But the reality is, non-Apple publishers and therefore advertisers now have access to a whole lot less customer data, right? When it comes to advertising on the Apple, when it comes to advertising to iPhone or Apple users, right? And that has led to lower performing campaigns. That's led to poorer attribution, and we're seeing that felt across the board with with all these other tech companies. One of the interesting remarks that I read in, I think it was Meta's earnings report, was that their impressions sold actually went up pretty significantly, right, year over year, but their effective price dropped by even more. Right? So which just goes to show if they're selling more impressions, but they're not able to target those impressions as well, that's one of the reasons why we may have seen such a sharp drop in their prices.
Yeah. That explanation makes a lot of sense, right? Without getting into the technicalities of it, app tracking transparency sounds like a series of policy changes. Apple's always had IDFA, which is the identifier for advertising, which is the unique ID that you and I can pull up on our phones and figure out what our IDFA is. So this is a policy that's basically centered around how much access and how much sharing is allowable within the bounds of your relationship as an advertiser with IDFA. But broad result, like you said, is poorer advertising, poorer attribution, poorer measurement, and low performance around campaigns. There's one school of thought that says, this is just Apple clamping down on privacy. There's another school of thought that says Apple has watched Google become this monopolistic advertising ecosystem and make so much money that they now want a piece of that pie.
I think it's pretty clear they want a piece of that pie, right? I think a lot of people might argue with the way in which they've done it, right? Positioning this as privacy first, and we are the company that cares about our users' privacy and we want to safeguard your data and so on. And I find their interpretation of what tracking means and their interpretation of first-party data as both very clever, but at the same time a little insidious.
If we were to take a step back, right? Yes, of course, there are several types of apps or companies that have been gutted by this policy, and that's visible in the last few quarters of revenue loss. Facebook being the biggest one. YouTube, of course, is what we saw in this week's earnings. Also, a lot of small game developers. While the earnings reports this week focuses on big tech, there's a lot of data around smaller game developers who basically cannot even survive. Forget losing share, stock value, or market cap. And I think that's going to be a massive impact across the industry.
I think that the sad part is that's happened every time any of these big tech platforms has made a change to their platform policies, right? We saw it happen with Facebook a few years ago, right? Where I know they changed something to do with the newsfeed algorithm and it ended up killing a whole cohort of small businesses, right? That's something similar, I guess. Yeah.
So if I were to take another step back, there are 5 concepts to me that are closely related but have subtle differences, right? There's privacy, there's identity, there's measurement, there's first-party data itself, which is a much broader field, and then there is targeting, which is the ability for advertisers to use all of this to drive more relevant advertising, which can be more performant in nature. You were talking to me the other day about an interesting Exchange Wire article you read, which broke down identity into a few different facets. Can you walk us through what that framework is?
Yeah, so there was an article by the CEO of a company called ID5. I think his name is Mathieu Roche. right? And he basically said there are 3 dimensions to identity in the advertising context, right? Number one is you got to do something to connect a user's offline identity, that is their email address or their phone number or whatever identifier you have, with their online identity, i.e., their online behavior, right? You need to be able to consistently identify these users across all the various devices that they use, right? And we know that's reality today because everyone has 2, 3, 4,
8, I'm
8
told. In
devices
Europe,
that they use.
if you count connected devices
If you
across your
can't
home.
connect to TV, yeah. And finally, going back to what you said about targeting and attribution, any kind of identity he feels needs to act as a common currency, right? That allows all the various parties in the ad ecosystem, the buyers, the sellers, exchanges, any other intermediaries, to kind of sell an ad to this customer, measure it effectively, attribute effectively, target effectively, and so on, right? So these are the kind of 3 dimensions of identity that he feels are most important to any kind of identity solution in the advertising space. And I agree with him. I think this makes perfect sense.
I think it's a very nice framework, especially for advertising. It has been many years since people have been talking about the death of third-party cookies. Our colleague Anil gave us a very interesting primer about the 30-year history of cookies as a concept and why it was invented for a totally different purpose before it was reused for advertising and targeting. But we're kind of now in the middle of this change where the deprecation of cookies has begun.
Yes.
The deprecation of third-party ID tracking has begun, like we've seen with ATT, but it's not complete. And while we're in this transition, there's a lot of technologies that are springing up trying to fill different parts of the value chain. I was thinking about why it's so important to get identity right. And in my opinion, there are largely 4 things or 4 wins that have to be achieved, which can only be achieved if identity is right. The first one is it helps sustain the open web. The second one is relevance. Elon Musk's letter yesterday specifically said irrelevant ads are basically spam. And he was calling on advertisers to create relevant ads and participate in the Twitter conversation or town hall, town square ecosystem. Much like TikTok did a while ago, where they called upon advertisers and said, don't bring your ads here, create TikToks, create short videos, create content that is native to this platform.
And he's right about that. I'll segue away from this for a moment and tell you about an experiment I did, on myself about a couple of years ago, where I got sick of tracking of any kind. I got sick of being followed around the internet by, a pair of shoes I was looking at. And I turned off targeted advertising across any platform that let me do that, right? And it ruined those platforms for me, right? I thought targeted ads were bad. Untargeted ads are just a million times worse, right? You end up getting followed by all kinds of rubbish, spam. People are trying to promote, their own blogs or whatever it is to you. And there was absolutely nothing of interest. So, I lasted about a year, I want to say, and then I just turned it all back on.
Yeah, it's true. I have a similar, every time I log into YouTube, and sometimes and I know this affects you as well, it erroneously logs in through a different Google account that I have, and I'm looking at all these videos and I'm like, this is not me. I feel like I'm in somebody else's house. So we forget that there is comfort in that environment. And if we think about privacy and security and the subtle differences between the two, I think what we mostly want is security. The other 2 reasons for me to get identity right is, one is measurement. Advertisers want to find better ways, A, to drive relevant advertising and find the right audiences, but also to be able to effectively measure what they are getting for their ad spend. And the last one is to prevent misuse and just create a safer environment. One of my readings of ATT as a series of policy changes and not as a single policy change is the fact that it's getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And there was this grace period of sorts between the first couple of versions, specifically around, for example, fingerprinting, which is the idea that you can find or you can with a high likelihood try and figure out who a certain person is or who a certain device is. There have been positive use cases for fingerprints, like, for example, banks. The minute they realize that your device is different and you're logging in using the same ID, they use that to try and fingerprint the fact that this might not be you and then take a certain set of actions. So there have been benign use cases, but fingerprinting can also be misused.
Yeah, most certainly.
Yeah. And what I've been reading is that the latest iteration of SKAD, which is their developer framework, which is similar to the privacy sandbox that Google is launching, is going to get tighter on cracking down on fingerprinting. And what I believe is that the company that's going to be most affected by this is Snap, who is already not having a nice time.
They really aren't.
Yeah.
They had a pretty terrible quarter.
Yeah, I think it was 3 quarters ago, Snap was talking about their framework called advanced conversion, which is their ability to model conversion as opposed to measure it. That's going to take a hit because that's always been non-compliant from an ATT standpoint. I wanted to segue into 2 things. One is, all of this has a bearing on policy changes. And I know GDPR started this in Europe, but today we're looking at every country possibly trying to create their own framework because governments are trying to A, show the public that they are hard on big tech and not allowing monopolistic companies to remain monopolistic. But also B, they're struggling to figure out what frameworks they need to create because the internet itself is moving at such a lightning pace.
No, you're right about that. GDPR kind of made the first big wave, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was, right? Since then, we've had a lot of countries and within country states, jurisdictions kind of looking into this. California's created its own parallel. India has been talking about it for the last, 3 or 4 years at least, basically from the day GDPR came out, right? And we've gone through drafts and we've gone through iterations, but we haven't really arrived at a final framework yet. But you're right. I think policymakers, I'm not sure they really get it. Right? I'm not sure we have, and this is not just India. This is across many, maybe most countries in the world, right? Policymakers are not the kinds of people who understand tech, advertising, and need to get into the details of something like this, right? So I think that's one limitation, and that's a reason why we're not seeing as many GDPR-esque regulations as we might have. But eventually, someone's going to figure this out, right? And eventually, we're going to reach a point where every country has a version of this regulation, right? Some may be looser, some may be tighter, some may be better enforced, and so on. But I imagine most countries, or maybe all countries, are going to have a version of this, right? And one of the things I'm curious about is what happens to advertising and what happens to ad tech in that world.
Do you think there is ever a scenario where all the countries get together and say, forget it, no policy, just free for all?
No, I don't think that's going to happen. But I think you may see something maybe one step better, which is a standard, right? The internet's been run on kind
Protocols
of
and
globally accepted standards and protocols pretty much as long as it's existed, right? And it's only now that countries are really stepping into it and kind of enforcing their own. I'm sure there are people there that have a view on why this happened and why this particular change happened and why countries decided to step in now. In my head, it's correlated with a lot of tech companies becoming really big.
Yeah, that's like.
But yeah, I would love to see a standard. I know it's something that groups like IAB are constantly working on, but I have a feeling that those kinds of large global standards are going to be a little harder to put together now.
Yeah. No, I agree. There are also a few interesting technologies that are sprouting up around identity and privacy. There are, of course, cookie replacement technologies.
Sure.
New companies focusing on identifiers of their own, trying to win the ID race, so to speak, although I don't believe that any one company is going to win. It's not going to be the Trade Desk. It's definitely not going to be Google. There are also data clean rooms.
Yes.
And we were talking about this in one of our team jams yesterday.
Yeah, we were talking about PAIR.
Google launched PAIR, which is the Publisher Advertiser Identity Reconciliation Framework, which is one way for a direct relationship to occur between advertisers and publishers. I found that to be a very interesting framework that I think will last. I don't know if it will be ubiquitous, and I don't know if it will be the only way that identity is solved for or privacy is solved for. But I definitely think for large advertisers and large publishers to come together, exchange data in a safe environment, and then be able to activate that data without the fear that that data can be misused or even taken out of that room, which is broadly the definition of a clean room itself. I'm excited about interesting new technologies.
Yeah, and it's very like Google to experiment with new technologies. It's most unlike them to put out a product that's kind of half done, which is what Pair sort of seems to be. They've built Pair on the back of 3 external or third-party data clean rooms, which is not something I've ever seen them do before. So it's interesting that they felt the need to put Pair out of the market so quickly that they couldn't build it in-house themselves, right? Which is the way they've traditionally built pretty much anything in the past.
There is some part of me that also thinks that's a signal to the market that they are
It's possible.
trying to do things and acknowledging the fact that the be all and end all of trust cannot be them. Like if they built Pair on their own and it was Google owned and Google operated and Google run, much like Topics, much like Flock, it's the federated learning of cohorts, much like most of the frameworks they've been trying to work on, there will be that element that says, hey, you cannot police something, that there's a conflict of interest if you are the ones creating this framework and you're also the ones using it. But it's
interesting to me, to think about what Google needs to do to get people to start trusting them again.
Yeah.
Right? Because if I think of where Google started, they started with search and very quickly reached a point where Google was the only way to search for anything, right? Basically, people trusted them for pretty much everything on the internet, right? And in the space of maybe 15 years, it's gone from there to a point where there's a lot of people I know, there's a lot of opinions I've seen that basically say Google search is now a terrible product, right? That it's more focused on ads than actually telling you what you want to know. People don't trust Google because of everything they do around privacy, because of all the data they've collected on you, right? So it's interesting for me to think about how they get back from here to a point where consumers and the advertising ecosystem kind of trust them again.
Yeah, absolutely. Peering into the future a little bit, while it's hard to see how identity will truly be cracked, whether it'll be a single protocol or whether it'll be a few technologies that come together in a more seamless way, I think it's important to get this right as soon as possible because the concept of first-party data itself is evolving.
Sure.
I was looking at some advancements in the metaverse and virtual reality, and we're not far from a time where a brain scan will be something that gets classified as first-party data. The last thing you want is technology to get there and identity to still be something that is not resolved. I don't think we want brain scans floating around the internet without a safe protocol.
No, I don't think so either. Fortunately, I think we're probably not as close to that as maybe you think.
I don't
Also,
know.
I think there's many countries that treat healthcare related data differently from everything else, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Right. US notably, I think Europe also has a pretty strong privacy framework around specifically health data.
Yeah.
So maybe the one kind of thing, the brain scans that you're talking about may not be really a problem, but I can certainly see other similar parallels that might be more concerning.
Yeah. I wanted to leave listeners with some food for thought. And you had a couple of questions that you had floated at the end of our conversation yesterday with the team.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you throw that open?
Yeah. So, in this whole conversation around identity, privacy, Pair recently, there's a lot of talk about first-party data, about cookies dying and advertisers having to rely more on first-party data to get any kind of relevant marketing done, which is true. But it leaves me wondering how advertisers are going to target people who aren't their customers, right? And who don't have, on whom they don't have any first-party data, right? I'm sure they'll find ways to do it, right? They used to, before third-party cookies became what they are, advertisers used to target websites, right? They used to target much more broadly, and maybe we'll see a little more of that. I wonder if we'll also see advertisers or publishers try harder to collect first-party data, right? Coincidentally, or maybe not, in the last couple of days, I've seen 3 or 4 free-to-access publications that I visit frequently have a pop-up screen that asks me to sign in. It's still optional at this moment,
But they will demand it itself.
But I imagine at some point they will demand it, right? Just to be collecting, better data. The second thing I wonder about is, we were talking about omnichannel a couple of weeks ago, right? And one of the problems that identity solves is this mythical creature called a single view of a customer, right? Which everyone's always chasing. I don't think anyone's really got there yet. I wonder how identity works when you throw things like non-digital media into the mix, right? Print, outdoor, radio, linear TV in some countries where it's not easily measured, right? Because if digital identity is solved, but kind of traditional old world media stay the same, then you're going to end up with digital ads where identity is kind of clean and managed and reconciled, and you have kind of half a view of a customer, and the remaining half still stays opaque, right? Which just seems like a weird place to be. I have absolutely no opinion on this. I do not know how this is going to get solved, but I'm interested just to see how things play out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note, that is some interesting food for thought for everyone to think about. While we have circled around various concepts around identity, I would love to do a deep dive on this with a technical expert at some point.
I think so, yeah. It's a very technical subject. I think the technicalities of it make it a little harder to understand even for lay people like you and me. I call us lay people, but maybe non-technical folks in the industry, right? But I think there's a need for someone technically sound to explain this to people in a non-technical manner.
So on one of our upcoming episodes, let's make sure we bring someone in who can give us a little more guidance from a technical perspective. But it's definitely a very, very interesting topic, and one that I would love to see the industry get right.
Yeah,
over the next few years at least. Thank you so much.
Thank you, as always.
As always, thank you, Gautam, Adarsha, Leena, and Santosh for joining us and for helping us produce this podcast. And we will see everyone next week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.